MKULTRA, the CIA mind control experiment that was real. What if one of the darkest conspiracy stories you have ever heard was not really a conspiracy? What if there were government documents, official investigations, and testimony under oath? This is the story of MKULTRA, a secret CIA program that investigated drugs, behavioral modification, interrogation, and the possibility of influencing human behavior. And the disturbing part is not that people imagined it. The disturbing part is that the program actually existed. Today, we are going to separate the documented facts from the myths. No exaggeration, no invented stories, just the historical record. And by the end of this video, you may understand why MKULTRA became one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American intelligence. The story begins during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global struggle for military, political, and technological power. Intelligence agencies feared that their enemies were developing new methods of interrogation and psychological manipulation. That created a dangerous question. Could drugs, hypnosis, psychological techniques, or other methods be used to influence human behavior? The CIA began investigating that question, and in 1953, Project MKULTRA was created. According to testimony presented before the United States Senate in 1977, MKULTRA operated from 1953 until 1964. It was not a single experiment. It was an umbrella program involving numerous subprojects, different researchers, different institutions, different experiments, and different methods. Among the subjects investigated were drugs and behavioral modification. One of the substances that became closely associated with MKULTRA was LSD. At the time, LSD was still relatively new to scientific research. Researchers were interested in its powerful effects on perception, behavior, and consciousness. But MKULTRA went far beyond simply studying a drug in a laboratory. According to the Senate investigation, intelligence agencies eventually conducted tests involving people who did not know they were being tested. Think about that for a moment. A person could be going about an ordinary day, while someone else was secretly conducting an experiment on that person. That is where the story becomes much darker. The Senate investigation found that some testing involved non-volunteer human subjects. The objective was not simply to understand what drugs did. The larger question was whether chemical or biological substances could be used operationally against individuals who were unaware that they had received them. That distinction is extremely important, because this was no longer just academic research. It was research connected to intelligence operations, and that created enormous ethical problems. The CIA Inspector General examined MKULTRA in 1963. The inspection found serious problems with the program's administration, documentation, oversight, and testing procedures. The report also raised concerns about excessive risk. And one issue became especially disturbing: the testing of substances on people who did not know what was happening. A later memorandum recorded discussions about the possibility of continuing unwitting testing. This is one reason MKULTRA remains so controversial. The historical record does not depend on rumors. There are government records, there are Senate hearings, there are declassified documents, and there are official investigations. But there is another chapter that makes the story even more mysterious. In 1973, much of the documentation related to the CIA's drug programs was destroyed. Years later, when investigators were looking into these activities, many of the records were gone. Imagine investigating a secret program, only to discover that many of the records that could explain what happened no longer existed. That does not prove every conspiracy theory, but it does explain why so many questions remain. And then something unexpected happened. Additional documents were discovered. Records that had not been destroyed were located in archived financial files. These documents gave investigators more information about activities associated with MKULTRA. They did not reveal everything, but they revealed enough to show that the surviving historical record was only part of the story. The program eventually became public during congressional investigations into intelligence abuses in the 1970s. In 1977, the United States Senate held a hearing specifically devoted to MKULTRA. CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified before the committee. The hearing officially placed the program into the congressional record. Think about what that means. Something that had once been secret was now being discussed publicly in the United States Senate. And this is where we need to make an important distinction. There are many stories about MKULTRA on the internet. Some are documented. Some are exaggerated. Some mix real events with speculation. And some claim things for which there is no reliable evidence. That is why it is important to ask a simple question. What do we actually know? We know that MKULTRA existed. We know that it involved research into drugs and behavioral modification. We know that LSD was part of the research. We know that some human subjects were tested without their knowledge. We know that the program was examined by the CIA Inspector General. We know that the Senate investigated it. And we know that many records were destroyed before investigators could examine the complete program. Those are not fictional details. They are part of the historical record. But there are other claims that remain uncertain. And this is where responsible investigation matters. A real secret program does not automatically prove every conspiracy theory built around it. That is an important lesson. The existence of one genuine secret operation does not mean that every mysterious story on the internet is true. In fact, MKULTRA teaches us something much more interesting. Reality can already be disturbing enough. You do not need to invent a hidden civilization, a supernatural explanation, or an imaginary government plot. Sometimes the real story is simply that powerful institutions can make terrible decisions, especially when secrecy, fear, and national security are used to justify extraordinary actions. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of MKULTRA. The scary part is not only what happened. The scary part is how secrecy can make accountability extremely difficult. When a program is hidden, when only a small number of people know about it, when records are destroyed, and when those affected may not even know they were part of an experiment, the public has very little ability to challenge what is happening. That is why historical documents matter. They allow us to compare rumors with evidence. They allow us to ask better questions. And sometimes, they force governments and institutions to confront actions that were once hidden from the public. MKULTRA ended decades ago, but the questions it raises remain remarkably modern. How much power should intelligence agencies have? Who supervises secret research? What happens when national security becomes an excuse for secrecy? Can scientific research be ethical when the people being studied do not know they are participating? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, how much history have we forgotten because the records disappeared before anyone could examine them? MKULTRA is often presented as a wild conspiracy story, but the historical record tells us something more complicated. It was real. It was secret. It involved controversial human experimentation. It was investigated by the United States Senate, and much of its documentation was lost or destroyed. That is enough to make the story disturbing, without adding anything that the evidence cannot support. And that is exactly why this story still matters. Because sometimes, the truth does not sound believable until the documents appear. This is only the beginning. There are other secret programs, other intelligence operations, and other historical cases where something once dismissed as impossible eventually became part of the public record. The next time you hear someone say, "That could never have happened," ask a different question. Where is the evidence? And sometimes, the answer may be more disturbing than the theory. This is Hidden History. Subscribe for more documented stories about secret experiments, intelligence operations, historical mysteries, and real conspiracies. Because the truth is often stranger than fiction.